This is what the battle system for my game looked like just a month ago, and this is what it looks like now. I'm making an action RPG in Unity inspired by games like Enter the Gungeon and Omori, and I've been working on the battle system for a while now. But currently, in my opinion, it's just not violent enough. Don't get me wrong, you are killing helpless snails and crabs. But right now it just doesn't feel right. I wonder what the issue is. Well, I'm sure that this terrible UI is not helping, and the fact that combat never even ends is probably also an issue. Actually, most of these issues are pretty obvious, so I'm gonna get to fixing them. I decided to first iron out the main combat loop of the game. Right now, enemies just follow you everywhere, and you also always have your sword out. So I went to create dedicated peace and combat states that you switch between. So I set up battle zones for the enemies. Whenever you enter the battle zone, you enter combat mode, and so the enemies within said zone. Plus, a wall pops up around you, trapping you in the zone. I don't know what these walls should look like, but I was thinking of making them maybe like ancient walls that you can see on the ground beforehand, which raise up whenever you enter, or maybe a thorny vine that grows whenever you go into the zone. I didn't end up making the art for it this month, but if you have any ideas, then be sure to comment them down below. But now there is a combat state, so there also kind of needs to be a peace state. I mean, there doesn't actually have to be, but I want the other characters to follow your leader around. So I set that up for the peace state. Unfortunately, right now, I only have the walk cycle for one player completed. So there are right now just 3 clones following each other around. And also in the peace state, I hide the weapons. I might eventually try to set up a system for putting the weapons on the back or in sheaths or something later, because I think that would look cool, but this is fine for now. And after this, I decided to focus on tweaking and improving the combat state. Currently, the game loop is pretty annoying, as you're in the middle of fighting and then out of nowhere, you are suddenly flung into the plan state. So after thinking about it for a while, I decided to fix this in probably the simplest way possible. I simply give you the choice of if you want to enter the plan state. You still have to be in combat for about 10 seconds, but then after waiting long enough, this UI box pops up and you can press P to switch to the pause state during the combat state. Obviously, I plan on making this UI look better, and also I plan on making this switch take a few seconds, like healing in Hollow Knight or something. That way you sort of have to move out of combat and get out of danger for a few seconds, or just tank a few hits, in order to escape from combat. Also, this gives you a bit more control over the flow of battles, which I think is good, but I also think it'd be a good idea to take this control away from you during boss fights, which sort of shifts the power away from you and towards the bosses, and also allows me to make more segmented attacks for them. And I think that'll be a pretty interesting shift. After playtesting the battles a bit, I decided to make some changes to the enemies. First off, I added a slight wait after the enemies finish attacking before they go back to movement. This just looks and feels a bit better. I also made the Dapper Snapper's dash a little bit easier to see coming, increasing the wind-up time before it attacks. And I also reduced the health for all enemies a bit, and I instead increased the amount of enemies to compensate. I might have to balance the attacks of the enemies out a bit with this as well, and make them create less bullets and be a bit less aggressive since there are more enemies now. Another annoyance that I noticed after moving the battles into more confined spaces was that the sword's projectile would just barely hit a wall and then get destroyed. I decided to make the projectile go through walls, which works for the most part, but it also allows you to hit enemies through walls, which I don't like. So I added one last part. I made the projectile check that there is a line between where the player was and where he first shot the projectile and where the enemy is now. So now you can't hit enemies through walls anymore. But finally, the last big change I made at the beginning of this month was just reverting a decision that I made a while ago. Back in Devlog 2, I made it so that you can switch characters at any time, and also that these characters share health and buffs. And I decided to not do that. Now each character has their own health bar, their own buffs, and you can only switch characters during the plan state. This should make the plan state more important, and also make battles a little bit more dynamic, as you can now lose characters during a battle, limiting your options and forcing you to make do. I don't think this is too overcomplicated. I just need to make sure that I have good clear UI that indicates the different characters' health levels during a battle. Speaking of this UI, at this point I did the bare minimum to make the UI look decent. Basically, I switched the font and color palette up a bit, and got rid of those ugly default Unity boxes. I've been thinking a lot about what I want the final style of the UI to be. My main ideas have been maybe a retro Windows 95 style or something similar to Persona 5. I'm definitely leaning towards the Persona 5 thing, although I really don't want to rip it off. Basically, I just want to have clean, simple text boxes with interesting shapes, and also have some HD character portraits and art. And also I think comic book or manga style paneling would look really nice over the UI. But also I want most of the UI to only be visible in menus, so that whenever you're in combat, I want to keep the screen as decluttered as possible. I took a break from all the big additions to just add a bit more polish to the game at this point, and I added some nice particles whenever you attack an enemy, as well as a flash whenever the player's dash recharges, just to make it a bit more obvious and easy to use. Finally, I decided to redo the destructible objects. Last devlog, I made these pitiful little things. And I made these as the Unity particle system because I thought it'd be simpler, and also better for performance. But honestly, the Unity particle system was just not made for 2D games. So instead, I just made some chunks of the sprites by cutting them up in the Unity sprite editor. And then I add these chunks to the prefab, and whenever you touch it, they get activated. And then I also apply some force and some normal force and some random torque to it, and voila, these objects can get really destroyed now. I also added a simple bouncing animation by making a scale up and down. I don't think it's perfect yet, but it does kind of look like they're bouncing. I also slowly went through and animated Yuri's walk cycle. It took less time and was easier than making Leon's walk cycle from scratch, but it still took a while. I made sure to differentiate the two in their poses, as Yuri's idle pose is different, and he has some slightly different accessories that move like his necklace, and he's 1 pixel taller. I only have to make Ava's now, but I need to finalize her design first before I can do that. At this point, I decided it'd be cool if weapons would have unique plan state acts that you can use whenever you have them equipped. So I decided to make one, and I went a bit overboard. I set up a system where weapons can now have these special acts assigned to them in the inspector, and these acts will be selectable in the plan state if you pick the player who has this weapon to be the attacker for the next combat state. And I also set up a system where acts can have completely custom and unique behavior written in scripts, which I will absolutely be using for this first weapon technique. I decided that this first technique would be made for the katana, and basically you'll lose the ability to attack and you just have to dodge all damage for a few seconds. And then, if you do that, you will deal pretty big damage to all enemies. So okay, let's get that working. And I got it all built out, but it's pretty freaking boring. While the fact that you can just hide in a corner from enemies is an issue that I need to solve, probably with pathfinding. This weapon technique literally just incentivizes hiding in a corner, so I'm going to redesign it. Instead, I went with one that is a lot more aggressive and a lot more fun in my opinion. You still lose your weapon and there's still a countdown, but you only deal damage if you dash through enemies. The more times you dash through them, the more damage it deals at the end of the countdown. Also, this still ends if you take damage. This move is super powerful, but it's still a major trade-off, as you lose the ability to deal damage, and if you're attacking more than just one enemy, then this isn't worth it, as you could deal more damage to one enemy in 10 seconds than you could from dashing 3 or 4 times through enemies with this. But if there are lots of enemies on screen, then this is a much better option. Taking a step back from active development, there were 2 big game design hurdles that I have to get over before I can continue on with development in the game later on. These are very important core decisions that will affect where I focus my development efforts on, how the game will play from moment to moment, as well as the audience that will be attracted to my game. First up, I have to finish up planning how combat encounters will work. But the main thing I have to plan is I have to decide on a long-term progression system. I am currently taking the approach of looking at every mechanic in my game and determining what point it serves. If this mechanic is just there because other games that I've been influenced by did it, that might be okay. But in that case, I need to take a very close look at why this mechanic was used in the game I was inspired by, and see if this use applies to my game in a similar way. For instance, I was wanting my enemies to have more health, because usually in other RPGs, battles with enemies take more time to complete than in mine. And I tried this, justifying it by thinking that enemies being bullet sponges would encourage more strategy and usage of the plan state. But it's just more fun in bullet hell games like this when you are fighting lots of enemies and taking them out one by one. And it's even more fun if you can take them out all at once. I'll just have to adapt the plan state to this design because it is simply more fun, which is the most important part of game design, finding the fun. So I'm ironing out all the edges in the combat system, but looking at more long-term gameplay loops, I need to iron out progression. So over the last year or so, I did some research, and by that I mean I played a bunch of RPGs. I'm definitely not a completionist, and I'm yet to finish a single one of them, despite the fact that I really enjoy my time with just about all of them. But in playing them, I found a bunch of different progression systems. The most standard one that I found is pretty much a leveling system, added on with a simple equipment system. In this system, you mostly just increase stats, and if there are new moves that you learned, then they are just learned when leveling up. Honestly, this is probably my least favorite progression system, because it is generally grind heavy and you just don't get to customize builds very much. Despite what I just said, this system can be done very well. After all, it's the base for most games. Persona 5 has this sort of progression. However, there are so many other forms of progression and leveling, like confidants and persona fusions, plus the actual system itself is fairly interesting in the ways that you gain XP, and all this together keeps it interesting, so it definitely can be done well. But personally, I don't really want to use it, and so the other big form of progression that I've really grown to love is a bit more rare. And technically, I think Yukikana is just another form of the other system. But I think that while the mechanics of the game may seem very similar at first, the way that it incentivizes you to play is completely different. And honestly, it's really only in 2 games. In Final Fantasy Tactics Advance and in Advance 2, there's a job system similar to other Final Fantasy games. However, there are 3 unique things about this one that make it interesting and make it something that I want to emulate. First off, you progress through a tree of jobs, needing you to master one job to move on to later ones. Secondly, job abilities are learned through weapons. Finally, you can combine classes and abilities together to create powerful combos. For instance, you can combine the dual-wielding passive ability of the ninja with the paladin's access to more powerful swords in order to dual-wield 2 super powerful swords. And when I was playing through Final Fantasy Tactics Advance and then A2, I found myself often planning mini battles ahead in order to create perfect class combinations. And I also took risk in these battles that forced me to adapt in battles by using weaker or different weapons on certain characters in order to master different skills associated with that weapon for use in battle or for unlocking later character classes. So I want to make a system like that. Basically, each of my 3 characters will have a tree of jobs they can progress through. Each job can use specific weapons and equipment and learn specific skills based on these equipment and weapons. After using a piece of equipment for long enough, you will master the skill associated with it and you'll be able to equip other weapons while still having that skill at your disposal. And if you master enough skills associated with a job, then you can unlock new jobs. And you can also equip the set of skills from one job as a secondary set to the jobs that you currently have. For instance, if your job is a berserker, you can also choose to equip your set of skills from the warrior class. Finally, there will be 4 categories of skills. Act skills, which you can use in the plan state and are the main skills. Passive skills, which gives you different effects and abilities like being able to dash more or dual wielding. Active skills, which you charge up and use during combat, and special techniques, which I'll get to in a bit. I know I just did a lot of explaining, but I'm looking for feedback before I go fully into working on the system in the future. Does this sound like fun? Did you enjoy the system that it's based off of if you played Final Fantasy Tactics Advance in the past? I know it's really hard to determine things like these without actually having the game in front of you to play, but any feedback is appreciated. Coming back into active development, at this point I thought I'd be done with the first weapon technique, but I have lots of ideas on how to make it better and I honestly can't resist adding them. First off, I decided that the current way that you use weapon techniques just doesn't cut it. Basically right now, which is a normal axe but more expensive, and I don't think this is exclusive or interesting enough, so I decided to rename weapon techniques to special techniques and change some things about them. First off, they are no longer tied to weapons, as they're too complex to make new ones for every single weapon I add. More likely instead, I'll tie them to jobs. But the second part that I haven't decided about yet is that I need to make a new way to charge them up. I was thinking of something like hitting weaknesses like in Persona or SMT, but there aren't any elemental weaknesses in the game, and I don't really want to add them, so I don't think that would really make sense. So if you have any ideas about this, I could really use some suggestions. But when it comes to the katana weapon technique that I have now, it's going to get some massive visual overhauls and some slight mechanical overhauls. First of all, I made it deal more damage and also got rid of it cancelling if you take damage while doing it. Since in the future it'll be more difficult to trigger, it really shouldn't have such a risk. Plus this incentivizes you to be even more aggressive with it, which is fun. And you still have the trade-off of not having a weapon while using it, and if you get hit, it still hurts like usual. So you can still die, so you're not just gonna run into bullets like crazy. So I think it's fine. Secondly, I added a few effects. A darkening of the background, an animation that the player sprite plays where it dashes out of existence. Some slashes that took a while to get looking right. And then whenever the player dashes back on screen, and he puts the katana back into the sheath, that's when everything dies. But no, that was not enough. Not quite. I added a screen shake to the stabs, and then I set up a whole system for zooming the camera in and out, including a system so the camera will automatically scale to fit all enemies that are currently active in it, which will probably be useful in the future. And I also drew up some UI. Now, my digital art skills are kinda rough, especially when it comes to inking. So I ended up just drawing this out on paper, and then taking a picture and tracing it and cleaning it up in digital. The hands aren't great, and it probably could have used a second frame, but I think that it gets the point across. So that is finally the first weapon technique completed. I probably spent too long on it, but I did develop lots of systems for it that I'll use in the future, like camera zooming and the weapon techniques in general. Plus, it does help with marketing to make small vertical slices of cool things that I want to be in the final game. Features like these are ones that I'll be able to show off on a Steam wishlist trailer whenever that needs to be made. I finished up by just implementing some smaller things that I've needed for a while. The biggest of these small changes was pathfinding. I decided not to code my own algorithm, because there's no reason to reinvent the wheel when someone else already made a better wheel that I can use for free. So I used the excellent A-Star pathfinding project to do the actual pathfinding, though I put in the time to properly learn how to use this API and build my own movement script using it. And after some adjustments, it works very well with the enemies. And I also decided to bring back fighters that are on your team again, since it's been a while since I've actually tried that out. So I just made a friendly slow roller, and although the pathfinding works, he kind of just gets stuck on whatever enemy he's fighting. Also, the enemies don't dodge each other or anything, so they kind of just shred each other whenever they battle. This will be an interesting feature to work out in the future, as I definitely want it in the game, but right now it's kind of janky. Nothing says violent like lots of weapons, and apparently violent is what I'm going for this devlog. So to finish this all off, I'm going to be making some of these new weapons. 3 to be exact, and each of these weapons will add something unique to the player's attack systems that hasn't been done before, which basically means that they'll each take a while to make, so I better get to it. First off, I'm going to make some guns. Yuri is going to be the main ranged character, so I'll give him the guns for now. Guns add one major complication that no other weapons have: ammunition and reloading. This shouldn't be super difficult to add, but I think it will make the guns more unique weapons to use, as now there is the added strategy of ducking behind cover whenever you have to reload. I started out with just pixeling a nice pistol, and then I added ammo and reload stats to not only the gun controller script, but also the gun asset scriptable object. This scriptable object is how I am managing having lots of guns. All weapons that the player uses in the game actually have the exact same scripts that aim and control them, but the values for these scripts are all supplied by whichever weapon asset is currently equipped. But anyways, I got reloading working, and I also added a reload bar real quick, that way you can tell whenever it's happening. I need to make some proper reload animations and ammo indicator UI later on, but now that the pistol is done, I'm going to quickly move on to the shotgun. The shotgun is pretty similar to the pistol, it just needs spread. So I pixeled a shotgun and then got into coding spread. I thought that this would be super simple, but for some reason after I added this random rotation of the spread, the bullet wasn't moving in the direction it was facing anymore. I guess the transform.write was not updating or something, and I tried literally everything, messing with the specific ways that I put it into code, checking for bugs everywhere, and I even did some trigonometry to try to calculate the new vector manually, but no luck. In a last-ditch effort, I remembered that I actually had added 2D bullet spread to a very old game jam I did, so I decided to see what was different in the code between my current project and the old one, and the only real difference was that back then I used transform.rotate instead of setting the rotate quaternion through an equal sign, so I figured that I might as well try that. And what do you know, it worked for some reason. I have no idea why this worked in particular and the other solution didn't, but now the shotgun is finally done. It took way longer than I expected. And finally, I decided to make Liam a new weapon. This is actually an idea for a weapon I've had for a very long time, even before Project C1. Basically, it's a big hammer. When you hit an enemy with it, it does somewhat low damage and knocks them back. But then, if the enemy hits a wall or another enemy while being knocked back, it will take another hit of damage. I set this up, pixeled the hammer, and it works, and it's really fun. I had one other weapon that I was planning on making, but didn't get around to implementing yet, but it's a staff for Ava. I have the pixel art done, but I'm not going to reveal what it does, as you'll have to wait until next devlog for me to finish it. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Be sure to like and subscribe and to follow development. Thanks for watching, bye.